The purpose of a military conquest is to take control of foreign economies, to take control of their land and impose tribute. The genius of the World Bank was to recognise that it is not necessary to occupy a country in order to impose tribute, or to take over its industry, agriculture and land. Instead of bullets, it uses financial manoeuvring. As long as other countries play an artificial economic game that US diplomacy can control, finance is able to achieve today what used to require bombing and loss of life by soldiers. Since 1944, the US has controlled the regulatory tools of global financial power by having sole veto power over the World Bank and IMF in order to facilitate its own dollar-denominated monetary hegemony. The function of the IMF and World Bank, Hudson writes, is essentially to make other countries borrow in dollars, not in their own currencies, and to make sure that if they cannot pay their dollar-denominated debts, they had to impose austerity on the domestic economy, while subsidizing their import and export sectors and protecting foreign investors, creditors, and client oligarchies from loss. The IMF and World Bank became, during the 1980s and beyond, centres for the propagation and enforcement of free market fundamentalism and neoliberal orthodoxy, writes David Harvey. In return for debt rescheduling, indebted countries were required to implement institutional reforms, such as cuts in welfare expenditures, more flexible labour market laws, and privatisation. Known as the Washington Consensus, these reforms hugely benefited the global 1%, whilst impoverishing much of the global south. Over 150 developing nations have been the recipients of this, America's dubious largesse. Joseph Stiglitz, Nobel laureate and former chief economist at the World Bank, writes that while the IMF claims that its recommendations were based on the best of economics, a combination of research and experience, in reality that was not the case. The policies being sold as being in the developing countries' and emerging markets' best interest were often nothing but the perpetuation of the pursuit of Western interest and Western ideologies. Furthermore, he writes, developing countries may face an impossible choice: agree to the terms of globalization as they've been set, or be ostracized, excommunicated. And even the latter is often not really a choice. Many of the developing countries have large amounts of debts. They are effectively in a debtor's prison. The creditors can demand what they will as a condition for the country getting the funds it needs to function. Global South countries have to play by the rules of a system rigged by the United States. This system, while not explicitly as destructive as other methods in the US's criminal playbook, is far and away one of the most harmful. Michel Chossudovsky explains that the US-led international financial order feeds on human poverty and the destruction of the natural environment. It generates social apartheid, encourages racism and ethnic strife, undermines the rights of women, and often precipitates countries into destructive confrontations between nationalities. Cambridge economist Ha-Joon Chang writes in his book from 2007 that growth failure has been particularly noticeable in Latin America and Africa, where neoliberal programs were implemented more thoroughly than in Asia. In the 1960s and 1970s, per capita income in Latin America was growing at 3.1% per year, slightly faster than the developing country average. Brazil especially was growing almost as fast as the East Asian miracle economies. Since the 1980s, however, when the continent embraced neoliberalism, Latin America has been growing at less than 1/3 of the rate of the bad old days. Even if we discount the 1980s as a decade of adjustment and take it out of the equation, per capita income in the region during the 1990s grew at basically half the rate of the bad old days, 3.1% versus 1.7%. Between 2000 and 2005, the region has done even worse. It virtually stood still, with per capita income growing at only 0.6% per year. As for Africa, its per capita income grew relatively slowly, even in the 1960s and the 1970s, 1 to 2% a year. But since the 1980s, the region has seen a fall in living standards. This record is a damning indictment of the neoliberal orthodoxy, because most of the African economies have been practically run by the IMF and the World Bank over the past quarter of a century. In Somalia, for example, a tight austerity program was imposed in the 1980s in order to service debts owed largely to Washington-based donors. The package undermined Somalia's fragile pastoral economy, which had kept the country self-sufficient in food until the onset of the reforms. The shilling was devalued in 1981, ostensibly to boost exports, leading to a dramatic decline in urban purchasing power. Spending programs and subsidies were curtailed and public infrastructure collapsed, leading to the impoverishment of Somalia's farming communities who couldn't compete with subsidised dairy and meat products being imported from the EU. By 1989, expenditure on health had declined by 78% in relation to its 1975 level, according to World Bank figures. The level of recurrent expenditure on education in 1989 was about $4 per annum per primary school student, down from about $82 in 1982. From 1981 to 1989, school enrollment declined by 41%, despite a sizable increase in the population of school age. Textbooks and school materials disappeared from the classrooms, school buildings deteriorated, and nearly a quarter of primary schools closed down. Teacher salaries declined to abysmally low levels. According to World Bank estimates, real public sector wages in 1989 had declined by 90% in relation to the mid-1970s. Average wages in the public sector had fallen to $3 a month, leading to the inevitable disintegration of the civil administration. Dependency on food aid, the famine of the early 1990s, and the resulting civil war all owe their actualization in part to the privatization and austerity programs mandated by the IMF and World Bank. These types of programs were imposed across the entirety of the Global South, thus devastating domestic economies and fostering dependency on Western donor institutions and benefiting Western multinational corporations. Corporations who take advantage of imposed deregulation by exploitatively investing in and then by taking the profit out of poorer countries. Today, neoliberalized, impoverished Global South countries are still being forced to slash social spending and deregulate in order to service exorbitant debts owed to Global North creditors. In the past 10 years, public debt in developing nations has reached an average of over 60% of GDP. Desperate to meet their payments rather than face a downgrading at the hands of the all-powerful credit rating agencies, writes Michael Gallant, 85 countries have turned to the IMF for additional finance since the COVID-19 pandemic began. The IMF, in turn, has used its power as a lender of last resort to impose its usual suite of austerity, deregulation and privatization. According to one Oxfam report, over 80% of IMF loans provided during the pandemic came with conditions of public sector budget cuts, with many maintaining austerity measures for years to come. A paper published by the Boston University Global Development Policy Center concluded that in 79 countries from 2002 to 2018, the IMF's austerity measures were significantly associated with the highest earners receiving more at the expense of the bottom 80%. The IMF and World Bank are tools of American imperialism. They benefit exclusively the business class at the direct expense of everyone else.